The evening was quiet in Los Angeles, but inside Keanu Reeves' home, silence carried a strange weight. He sat on the balcony, looking at the sky, his eyes calm yet heavy with thought. Sometimes he felt the world saw him as a man of mystery, a face on the screen, a star who had it all. But the truth, hidden deep in his heart, was different. He longed for something simple, something pure. He longed for a partner who could walk with him not as a fan, not as a stranger chasing fame, but as someone who would see his soul. He whispered to himself, almost afraid of the words, "I wish for a wife, not just any wife. Someone who understands silence, who values kindness, who can share the smallest joys with me." This thought stayed with him for days. It was not about romance painted by Hollywood lights. It was about companionship. Keanu wanted someone to hold his hand during storms and laugh with him in quiet kitchens. Someone who did not measure life with wealth, but with warmth. At a charity event weeks later, Keanu found himself standing beside Sandra Bullock. The two had shared years of friendship, laughter, and even unspoken moments where silence carried more meaning than words. They had worked together on films, shared struggles of fame, and learned how loneliness can follow even the most admired faces. Sandra noticed his quiet mood that night. She leaned closer and asked softly, "You seem far away. What are you thinking about?" Keanu looked at her hesitant. He was not a man who spoke easily about his inner life. But something about her honesty, her kindness, allowed him to open his heart. "I was just thinking," he said slowly, "about what it would mean to have a wife, someone real, someone true. Not the glitter of this world, but a partner who cares when no one else is looking." Sandra's eyes softened. She was used to hearing glamorous confessions in Hollywood, but this was different. Keanu's words came from a place of truth, not from the surface. She stayed silent for a moment, letting the weight of his wish sink into her heart. Later that night, as the event ended, Keanu offered to walk her to her car. The city lights flickered around them, but their steps felt steady, almost timeless. He did not realize it then, but the simple honesty of his words had already begun to stir something deep inside Sandra. On her drive home, Sandra kept hearing his voice. She thought about how rare it was to meet a man who wished for something so humble, so human, in a world built on illusions. She found herself smiling quietly, her heart warming with respect. Days turned into weeks, but that moment stayed alive. Sandra began noticing things about Keanu that others often missed. How he greeted strangers with kindness, how he chose humility over attention, how he listened more than he spoke. His wish for a wife was not about filling his own emptiness, but about sharing kindness, building a life of meaning. One evening, she called him. Her voice carried a mix of nervousness and warmth. "Keanu," she said, "I have been thinking about what you told me, your wish. It touched me more than you know." He stayed quiet, listening. "You see," she continued, "most people speak of love in ways that sound like performance. But you spoke about love like it was a home, and I think that is why it melted my heart." The silence between them was long, but it was not empty. It was full of possibilities, of emotions they had both kept hidden for years. Keanu finally spoke, his voice gentle. "Maybe one day, Sandra, wishes find their way into reality." She smiled, though he could not see it through the phone. "Maybe they already are." That night, both of them lay awake in different homes, yet their hearts felt closer than ever before. Keanu had spoken his truth, and Sandra had given him something even more powerful in return: hope. And so the journey began, not with grand gestures, but with a wish, a reply, and the soft glow of respect that slowly started to light a new path for both of them. The morning after their quiet phone call, Sandra Bullock sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She stared at the steamless cup, replaying Keanu's words again and again. Maybe one day wishes find their way into reality. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way he said them. Soft, careful, as though each syllable carried a weight he wasn't ready to fully reveal. She wondered why his confession felt different from any she had ever heard. In Hollywood, people spoke of love like a headline, something to announce, something to decorate. But Keanu spoke of love like it was a shelter, like it was air he couldn't live without. That difference was what kept her awake through the night. Later that day, Sandra met with a close friend who noticed her distracted mood. "You've been quiet lately," her friend said. "Something's on your mind." Sandra tried to shrug it off, but the truth pressed against her chest. "It's Keanu," she finally whispered. "He told me something that sounded less like a dream and more like a prayer. He wished for a wife, but not in the way people usually do. He wished for someone who sees him, not the image, not the fame, and I can't get those words out of my head." Her friend smiled knowingly. Maybe those words weren't meant to leave your head. Maybe they were meant to enter your heart. That night across the city, Keanu sat alone with an old notebook. It wasn't filled with film scripts or business plans. Instead, it was full of letters he had never sent. Letters written to no one in particular, to the wife he had always hoped to have. Simple words about simple dreams. Sharing breakfast, watching sunsets, holding hands during storms. As he flipped through the worn-out pages, one letter caught his eye. Dear future wife, I don't know who you are, but I hope you are someone who believes in kindness more than success. I hope you laugh at my quiet jokes and remind me that silence can be music too. I hope you don't mind that sometimes I sit by myself for hours, not because I don't love, but because I feel love in silence. He closed the notebook gently. Those letters were his hidden world, the part of him he never showed anyone, not even Sandra. But that night, as he sat in the dim light of his living room, he thought of her. Could she be the person he had been writing to all along? Days passed, but something subtle began to change. When Sandra and Keanu met for coffee or events, their conversations felt heavier with unspoken meaning. There were glances that lasted too long, pauses that said more than words ever could. Yet neither of them dared to break the fragile silence between them. The suspense of the unspoken grew. It was as if they were standing at the edge of a bridge, afraid to take the first step, fearing it might collapse beneath them. But at the same time, they knew that bridge was the only way to the other side. Then came a moment neither expected. Sandra invited Keanu to her home one Sunday evening. She had kept it casual, just dinner, just friends. But as the hours unfolded, it became clear that something deeper was at play. In her living room, surrounded by books, candles, and quiet music, Sandra asked him a question that seemed simple but carried weight. Keanu, do you believe wishes come true? He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flicker of candlelight. I believe they can, he said slowly, but sometimes they need someone brave enough to answer them. Sandra's breath caught. She realized then that she was not just listening to a man's dream, she was standing at the center of it. She placed her cup down, her hands trembling slightly. And if someone was ready to answer your wish, she asked softly. The room grew still. Even the music seemed to fade into silence. Keanu didn't rush to reply. He never rushed with words, not when they mattered. Instead, he leaned back, studying her face, searching for something. Then I think, he whispered, that would melt my heart. Those words struck her like lightning. She felt the air around her shift, heavy with possibility. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it was a doorway, and she could feel herself stepping closer to it. The evening ended without grand gestures. No kiss, no sudden declarations. But when Keanu left her home that night, Sandra stood at the door, her hand on the frame, her heart racing like she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she realized this was not just friendship. It was something fragile, precious, and dangerous. The kind of bond that could either grow into a love story that healed both their souls or break them in ways they could never repair. And that suspense was what made it real. The following week brought with it a strange rhythm, one that neither Keanu nor Sandra fully understood. It was as if their lives had been quietly rearranged by the words they had exchanged. Both went about their days, scripts, rehearsals, public appearances, but beneath the noise of Hollywood there was a new silence, one that pulsed with unspoken meaning. Keanu noticed it first. When Sandra laughed at something trivial, he felt her laughter linger inside him long after the moment had passed. When her name appeared on his phone, even for a simple message, he stared at it longer than necessary, his heart catching in ways he couldn't explain. Sandra, on her part, began to observe him with new eyes. She had always admired his kindness, but now it struck her differently. She saw how he held doors open for strangers without thinking, how he thanked crew members by name, how he always carried a kind of humility that felt almost rare in their world. These weren't acts of politeness. They were habits of a soul that had been trained by pain and softened by grace. One evening, Sandra found herself lying awake, unable to sleep. She thought about his wish for a wife, about the way he had said it with a voice full of quiet longing. She wondered if she was already halfway down that path, without realizing she had started walking. Days later, she invited him to join her at a small bookshop in the city. It wasn't one of the loud Hollywood places where cameras flashed. It was tucked away, quiet, with shelves stacked high and the smell of old pages lingering in the air. Why here? Keanu asked as they walked in, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. Sandra smiled. Because love isn't only found in grand places, sometimes it's hidden in corners no one notices. They wandered through aisles, talking about books, childhood memories, even their fears. Keanu admitted he often wrote letters he never sent. Sandra admitted she often cried at night, not because she was sad, but because she sometimes felt the weight of living two lives, one for the world and one for herself. "That's why I think," Sandra said, running her fingers along the spines of old books, "that love is not about being perfect. It's about being safe with someone, safe enough to cry, safe enough to be silent, safe enough to be seen." Keanu's steps slowed. Her words wrapped around him like a blanket, familiar yet new. He looked at her, and for the first time the thought crossed his mind with startling clarity. Maybe she is the answer to the wish I whispered. But fear lived in his heart too. Keanu had lost before: love, family, dreams. The thought of opening his heart again terrified him. What if this was another wound waiting to happen? What if by stepping closer he risked losing the one person who had always been his anchor? The tension built in silence. As they left the bookshop, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then heavy. They ran to shelter under an awning, their shoulders brushing, their laughter breaking through the sound of the storm. In that moment it felt as if the world itself had paused, holding them in its breath. Keanu's eyes met hers, the rain dripping from his hair, his heart pounding. He wanted to speak, to tell her that his wish was no longer abstract. It had a name, it had a face, it had always been her. But the words froze in his throat. Instead, Sandra broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, "you talk about wishing for a wife, but I think what you're really wishing for is a home, not a place but a person, someone who makes you feel less like you're wandering." Keanu exhaled, his chest tight. "And do you believe such a home exists?" She looked at him, her eyes steady despite the storm. "I believe sometimes it's standing right in front of us, but we're too afraid to open the door." The words hung heavy between them, more powerful than any declaration. It wasn't love yet, not spoken out loud, but it was close, so close it almost hurt. As the rain eased, they stepped out together, walking slowly side by side. Their clothes were damp, their hair messy, but their hearts were alive in ways they hadn't felt in years. Yet beneath the warmth, a shadow lingered. Both of them knew that stepping forward meant risking everything: their friendship, their trust, their fragile peace. And neither of them was ready to face that storm just yet. So they carried the suspense quietly, each heartbeat louder than words, each glance holding secrets they were too afraid to speak. But the world has a way of forcing truths into the open. And soon, a twist neither of them expected would test not only their bond, but also the strength of the wish Keanu had dared to share. The rain-soaked evening at the bookshop stayed with both Keanu and Sandra like an unspoken secret. Days passed, yet their thoughts returned again and again to the words exchanged under that awning, to the weight of what almost escaped their lips. They lived in the same city, breathed the same air, and walked in circles around each other. Yet it felt as though they were standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying, something that could either heal them or break them. Keanu tried to bury himself in his work. Film sets, interviews, long hours under bright lights. But behind every smile he gave the cameras, behind every polite answer, there was a silence gnawing at him. When he returned home at night, his empty apartment reminded him that wishes meant nothing if left unspoken. Sandra, too, carried the heaviness in her chest. She was known to the world as strong, witty, and radiant, but behind closed doors, she often found herself staring into the quiet corners of her house, wondering why her heart beat faster whenever she remembered the softness in Keanu's eyes. Then came the invitation. A producer organizing a charity gala requested both of them to appear. The event promised photographers, flashing lights, and questions that often cut too close. Sandra hesitated, but Keanu agreed, and so she followed. The night of the gala was heavy with expectation. The hall glimmered with chandeliers, the air filled with laughter that was more performance than joy. When Keanu arrived, his simple black suit stood out among the glitter. Sandra entered later, her presence radiant yet calm. Cameras turned, whispers spread. They were seen together again. During dinner, a journalist approached with a sly smile. "Mr. Reeves," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "you've spoken before about wishing for a wife. Tell me, is Miss Bullock the answer to that wish?" The room froze. Sandra's fork paused midway. Keanu looked up, his face steady but his heart racing. It was a cruel trick, the kind of public question that demanded an answer but allowed no safe ground. He could have laughed it off, dismissed it as rumor. But instead, Keanu chose honesty. "Some wishes," he replied softly, "are too precious to answer in public." Gasps, whispers, and flashes followed. Sandra's eyes met his, and in that moment she saw the courage it took for him to speak those words. But courage had a cost. The media spun stories overnight, twisting their friendship into headlines, building castles of gossip on foundations of silence. Within days, Sandra's phone was flooded with calls. Some congratulated, others speculated. Directors questioned whether her personal life would distract from her career. And beneath it all, she felt the sharp sting of fear. One evening, she called Keanu. Her voice was firm but tired. "This is getting out of hand. They're not just writing stories, they're building cages for us. And I can't live inside a cage, Keanu. I fought too long to be free." His chest tightened. He had wanted honesty, but not like this, not at the cost of her peace. "Sandra," he said quietly, "I never meant for this to happen. I was just trying to protect something fragile, but maybe silence would have been safer." The line went quiet. Her breathing filled the space between them. "Sometimes," she whispered, "silence isn't safety, it's distance. And I don't want distance from you, but I also don't want the world to decide for us." Her words cut deeper than any headline. He realized then that this was the first true conflict between them. Not born of anger, but of fear. Fear of losing each other to the noise of the world. That night, Keanu returned to his old notebook. He turned to the latest page and wrote with trembling hands, "Dear future wife, I almost lost you today, not because we fought, but because the world tried to speak louder than our hearts." Meanwhile, Sandra sat alone on her couch, scrolling through the endless wave of news. Every article, every photo, felt like a shadow creeping into the private corner of her soul. And yet beneath all the noise, there was still the echo of his words. Some wishes are too precious to answer in public. She closed her eyes, pressing her hand against her chest. She knew the world could twist stories, but it could not twist the truth that had begun to grow between them. And so, with quiet determination, Sandra made a choice. If their bond was to survive, it would have to face storms, not avoid them. What neither of them knew was that a greater test was already on its way. One that would force their hearts into the open, leaving no room for silence, no space for hesitation. The storm of rumors did not fade. It grew louder with each passing day. Headlines spread like wildfire, painting stories that neither Keanu nor Sandra had spoken aloud. Every smile was misread, every glance magnified, every silence filled with speculation. The weight of it all pressed against them, threatening to crush the fragile bond they had only just begun to understand. Keanu found himself retreating into solitude more than ever. His home became his shelter, but also his prison. He read the articles not for truth, but to see how the world twisted honesty into entertainment. And in those long hours of silence, he began to wonder, was his wish too heavy, too dangerous to share? Had his longing for something pure placed Sandra in harm's way? Sandra, on the other hand, wrestled with her own battles. Friends warned her to step back, to protect her image, to avoid being tied to someone else's wish. But her heart knew better. It wasn't the world's opinion that frightened her. It was the thought of Keanu retreating so far into himself that she might lose him forever. Then one evening, fate decided to intervene. Sandra received an invitation to a quiet gathering hosted by a mutual friend. She almost declined, exhausted from the noise of the media. But something inside urged her to go. And when she walked into that small, dimly lit room filled with laughter and music, her eyes met his. Keanu was there, sitting quietly at a corner table, a glass of water in his hand instead of wine. His expression softened the moment he saw her. It was as though the crowd disappeared, leaving only the two of them in that moment. She walked over, her steps steady though her heart raced. "You've been hiding," she said gently, her voice carrying both accusation and concern. He gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I thought maybe the world would quiet down if I stayed away." Sandra sat across from him, leaning forward. "And did it?" He shook his head. "No, the world never quiets. It only grows louder when you try to silence it." For a moment their eyes locked, and in that gaze they both knew the truth. They couldn't keep running. They had to face the storm together or they would be swept apart by it. Later that night, as the gathering wound down, Keanu walked her outside. The city was alive around them, but their steps were slow, heavy with unspoken words. Sandra stopped near the street lamp, her face glowing in the warm light. "Keanu," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "do you know why your wish melted my heart that night?" He turned to her, his silence urging her to continue. "Because it wasn't about wanting someone to complete you. It was about wanting someone to share life with you. That kind of wish, it's rare, it's real, and I've carried it in my chest every day since you said it." His breath caught. He wanted to speak, but the weight of her words pressed against him like gravity. "But," she continued, her voice breaking slightly, "I need to know something. If I step into this with you, if I answer your wish, will you let the world scare you away? Or will you stay even when it gets hard? The question pierced him deeper than any headline ever could. For a long time he said nothing, battling the ghosts of his past. The pain of loss, the fear of loving and losing again, the scars of grief, all of it whispered for him to retreat. But then, louder than the ghosts, came the memory of her smile, the way she listened without judgment, the way she turned silence into safety. He looked at her, his voice low but steady. I can't promise the world will be kind, but I can promise I won't run from you. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of release. She had waited to hear those words, waited to see if his wish was strong enough to hold against the storm. Just then, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. A photographer had found his way near the corner, camera in hand, lens glinting under the streetlight. Instinctively, Keanu moved closer to Sandra, shielding her from the harsh flash. But instead of anger, instead of frustration, he simply held her gaze. Let them see, he whispered. Let them see something true for once. The camera clicked, capturing a moment that neither of them tried to hide. Not a staged pose, not a forced smile, but a man and woman standing close under a street lamp. Their eyes locked in a way that spoke louder than any headline ever could. Later that night, Sandra lay awake replaying it all. The confrontation, his promise, his quiet strength. For the first time, she felt not just the weight of his wish, but the beginning of an answer forming within her own heart. But with every step forward, new challenges waited. Love had begun to take shape between them, but so had the obstacles. The world was watching, and the real test was still to come. Because love, as they were about to learn, is not proven in quiet moments alone. It is proven when storms crash hardest, when choices cut deepest, and when hearts are forced to decide whether to hold on or let go. The photograph taken under the street lamp spread across the world within hours. It wasn't glossy or perfect. It was raw, real, and unpolished. Keanu shielding Sandra from the harsh flash, their eyes locked, their closeness speaking louder than words. Some called it romance, some called it speculation, but for those who looked closely, it was something more. It was truth. The following days, both of them felt the weight of that image. Sandra received messages from friends and strangers alike. Some warned her to stay cautious, others cheered her on. Keanu, as always, tried to stay away from the noise, but even he couldn't avoid the ripple effect. What surprised them most wasn't the gossip, it was the quiet respect the photo generated. People saw kindness in it, tenderness, humility. For once, the world wasn't mocking, it was listening. Still, doubts lingered. Late one evening, Sandra called Keanu. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the question hiding inside. Keanu, are you sure you're ready for this? Because the truth is, once we step forward, there's no stepping back. The world won't forget. They'll follow, they'll twist, they'll test us. Keanu listened, the silence stretching long. Finally, he spoke. Sandra, I've spent years hiding in silence, thinking it kept me safe, but safety isn't the same as living. When I told you my wish, I wasn't asking for perfection. I was asking for someone to walk beside me, even in storms. And if that person is you, then I'd rather face the storm than live in silence again. Her chest tightened, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't a movie line. It was truth, plain and unshaken. A week later, they attended another event together. This time, there was no attempt to hide. They walked in side by side, simple, calm, unafraid. The cameras flashed, the whispers rose, but Keanu held Sandra's hand, not as a show, but as an anchor. Midway through the evening, a journalist asked directly, Mr. Reeves, Ms. Bullock, are you finally ready to confirm what the world has been waiting to hear? The room fell silent, every ear tuned in. Sandra glanced at Keanu, and he nodded faintly. She turned back to the crowd, her voice gentle yet firm. What you saw in that photograph wasn't a performance. It was a moment between two people who have shared years of respect, kindness, and trust. If you want a headline, here it is. Sometimes a wish is answered not with grand declarations, but with someone who stands beside you when the world is loud. Keanu added softly, I wished for a wife who would see me, not the image. And the truth is, Sandra has always seen me. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but tonight I know this. My wish is no longer just a wish. The hall erupted in applause, not of gossip, but of respect. Even those who had doubted felt the sincerity in their words. That night after the event, they walked together under the open sky. No cameras, no flashing lights, just two souls finally free of silence. Keanu turned to her, his voice quiet, almost breaking. Thank you for answering my wish. Sandra smiled, her eyes glistening. And thank you for reminding me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to believe in love again. They didn't need a stage, they didn't need the world's approval. All they needed was the courage to be seen, as they truly were, two people scarred by life, yet still soft enough to wish, still brave enough to love. As they walked hand in hand, the night felt lighter, as if even the stars above were applauding quietly. For once, the world outside and the world inside their hearts finally matched. Keanu's wish had found its answer, and Sandra's heart had found its home.